Welcome to this ICMI20 interview of Professor Dennis Hayes with myself, William Collins, and Elizabeth Hobson. Now, Professor of Education Dennis Hayes has a CV too long to reiterate in full. He's the founder and director of the campaign group Academics for Academic Freedom. He coordinates the Education Forum for the Institute of Ideas, and is well known for his educational journalism, including countless appearances on national and local TV and radio programmes. He's authored at least a dozen books, including in 2008 with Catherine Eccleston, The Dangerous Rise of Therapeutic Education. There it is. So, Professor Hayes, welcome.
Welcome.
Can I kick off the questions then? On that theme of the dangerous rise of therapeutic education, it was a book that caused quite a stir at the time. Can you tell us what you mean by therapeutic education, and why did the book cause such a stir, and why is it dangerous?
You can define therapeutic education in one simple sentence. It's the emphasis on the emotions over the intellect. That's what it means. In every aspect of education and every sector of education, that has become the norm since we first wrote the book. I would say that emphasis on the emotions has now become institutionalized. And then that means it's just accepted. So you might say, what's wrong with it? You know, people say, everything's about the intellect and the emotion. You shouldn't separate them out. And normally when they say that, they're about to play down the intellect over the emotions. So people who argue for balance. But why is it dangerous? And the simplest way of understanding is if you emphasize your emotions, you tend to look at yourself. So from kindergarten to retirement groups, everybody's looking at themselves rather than looking at the wider world. And we had a little motto for the book. Mike Taylor, and then a South London teacher, who's now at the East London Science School, said, you know something's changed when children want to know more about themselves than the world. So you may say, fine, so people want to know about themselves. The danger is it damages them because it takes them away from the study of educational subjects. So instead of learning about the world through geography, history, literature, art, they become obsessed in a narcissistic way with their own emotions and feelings. So we said it's two things. It's an attack on school subjects, which is, you know, people hate subjects. That's, well, the trade unions, everyone hates subjects. They all want to have themes and various replacements and emphasis on skill.
When you say everyone, you mean everyone in the educational, you know, arena rather than the public?
The public are being taught to want this. I mean, I would say everybody, teacher trainers, universities, schools, everyone, the unions all emphasize skills and various ways of learning, because it's often activity based.
Yeah, I must admit the word skills is not a word that was ever used when I was at school, and yet when my boys went to school, and they're mid-30s now, so this is a fair while ago, they all talked about skills even at that time. So it was a weird thing.
Well, of course, the shift now is not to skills of the sort of things you might need for work, which is might have traditionally. It's when you're short of jobs, you start to say people need skills. That's again blaming them for not having the skills rather than not being work. But now it's soft skills that are over. When you look at any discussions of skills, it's all soft skills. It's empathy, being able to work in a team, being able to communicate. But to make my point about this attack on the subject is dual, because it's not just an attack on the school subjects, but attack on you as a child or a student or an adult as a knowing subject, as a human subject. And that is where the danger comes in. So you replace knowing with feeling, and then you can be manipulated. And the thing is, the most scary thing about the whole of the educationalists who are involved in this, it's very manipulative. Because when you start playing with children's emotions, it becomes almost something you wouldn't imagine in the Stalinist Soviet Union. You know, those sort of things didn't happen. And we give lots and lots of examples. I mean, you know, the funny one from the book that we always give is a small child crying. Mum and dad say, "What's wrong with you? I don't want to go to school tomorrow. Why?" And he said, "Well, it's my turn to put my worries in the worry box." And they said, "Well, but I haven't got any worries." And so, well, you're not allowed not to worry, and you're not allowed to just feel. I mean, it is a manipulation of your emotions, because the emotions you're not allowed to feel, of course, are the really good ones, like anger, jealousy. I mean, I've been jealous of lots of things. That really motivates me. You know, anger about things, but you don't, it's not those emotions. Be empathetic, considerate. So you are playing with emotions as well. So that's very dangerous. But you're also, so we had a debate about this. It must have been before the book came out, and they'd set us up with a feminist speaker. And we thought we were going to have a debate about different sorts of knowledge. And she said something that I thought was really important. She said, before we can have a debate about different sorts of knowledge, whether male knowledge or female knowledge or whatever, we've got to take this issue up. And she said, what's happening now is people are being denied the possibility of an intellectual life. Being denied the possibility of an intellectual life. And that is incredibly dangerous.
Yeah.
So, and the thing about all these activities like circle time and you know, and even, you know, working in the woods, now we get these things like forest schools. All this is getting, you know, back to nature. Anything about your feelings and adjusting your mental health means that you never stop wanting more and more reinforcement of your feelings.
There's all this thing about self-esteem as well, isn't there? That I mean, that never featured in my education.
You can time these things, because when we wrote about it, first of all, we responded to exactly that. So in the early noughties, self-esteem was the big issue. You know, everybody who got thrown off out of the Big Brother house or whatever said, "Oh, it's destroyed my self-esteem." Everybody was obsessed by self-esteem. And then it became, people said, well, that's a bit negative. And then the people started, well, talk about reliance and resilience. So make people more resilient. Then it became even cruder. Let's make people happy. Let's improve people's well-being. And of course, nowadays, it's improve everybody's mental health. So
they're not doing a very good job of it, are they? I mean, the common mental disorders are soaring, especially amongst young people. I mean, one of the questions I was going to ask is therapeutic education responsible for the rise of common mental disorders in young people?
Well, I mean, I'm going to say yes. I mean, part of the issue is if you emphasize emotions and you exaggerate the impact of your feelings, so that, you know, if you take a university example, you used to have Freshers Week, and now it's often rebranded as Welcome Week. So you don't go and get challenged by various left-wing groups or people wanting to engage in things. It make you feel comfortable because it's too stressful to leave home. And so the whole institutional thing means that, you know, you're seen as vulnerable. And then, but the danger is, and I wrote something about bullying a long time ago, and it was about in FE, but I said, the title was Being Bullied, Just Grow Up. And then, of course, you realize if you keep telling people that they're bullied by emails and they're bullied by people asking them to do some work, they then start to feel bullied. Yeah. I think you see that with the mental health issue. If, you know, some people have said up to 70% of young people and children have got mental health issues. That can't be true.
No. There's actually a wonderful Germaine Greer quote when she appealed to women to just feel less.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, that's something that you can learn. And, you know, I mean, I've had my mental health problems as a result of trauma. And what got me out of it was firstly getting angry with myself, that taboo emotion, and then deciding to feel less. And now I'm all right. And then I pursued intellectual pursuits.
But when we first when we first came out, and people used to cry. I mean, we remember one instance about the damage we were doing to young people. There is a sort of emotional blackmail that you're seen as callous. If you say to people, feel less. I mean, one of the things about the book that was really interesting, when the second edition came out with a new preface, we had Catherine and I thought about what had really changed. And of course, one thing that was obvious, because in 2016, one of the words of the year was, do you remember what it was? 2016? Everybody says Brexit, but there was another one.
Oh, no.
Snowflake.
Snowflake. Of course. So,
and one of the things that I think we sort of got wrong, but when the book first came out, people said, well, it's true about all these other things. You know, it's happening in primary school and perhaps secondary school. It'll never happen in universities. Because we've written the Therapeutic University and worried about it. And of course, universities have become the not only centre of emotional education, but they spread it everywhere else. A lot of these things spread from university into the wider community, you know, petting zoos and trigger warnings, the idea that you must have a safe space from ideas. And it's coming from universities. And I go around and collect things. I don't know if I put this one in the book, but if you, as a sign of what's going wrong, I went to the LSE and there was a sign on the wall that said, a course for students overcoming perfectionism. And it said you might come to the LSE and you want to do really well. You might want to go back to if you come from another country and really achieve something. And this may cause you distress. You might have to do a course to lower your expectations. And Oxford School for Girls, I think it was, had a similar program called The Death of Little Miss Perfect, which was because the students wanted to do the best they could. And they thought this was
awful.
You can start to see how, if that's happening at the top schools and top universities, then it goes everywhere. And often it does come from, you know, the first time I ever came across the idea of a therapy dog or a petting zoo, you know, they're from top universities. Harvard, I think Harvard Law School was the first school to introduce a therapy dog, because if you train to be a lawyer at Harvard, you know, you might feel nervous and you have a dog with you to stroke. You know, what is that saying about human beings? You know, it's saying that you're pathetic and you can't cope. But of course, if you now say you can't cope, there's a lot of support for you. That's the way you relate. People relate to the wider world. You know, I've seen it even, you know, if you're a police officer, you know, tooled up on the streets, you often present yourself as vulnerable. And that's how you do it. And so if you present yourself as vulnerable, and this is the twist to all this, is it makes you powerful. Matthew Paris wrote a very good article about it many years ago and said that if you say that I'm a victim, how can you challenge anybody?
Well, that's something I did a reading of a Peter Wright article only last night, and it's called Aggrieved Entitlement, which is a Michael Kimmel quote where Kimmel uses it to suggest that men respond to the loss of their power and privilege in a changing world by being, you know, angry and violent and whatever because of this aggrieved entitlement. But Peter suggests that actually perhaps women respond to the loss of chivalry in the same way. And he goes on to reference an Ernest Belfort Bax piece that he wrote at, like, you know, the turn of the 1900s, where he talked about aggressive weakness. And I think we've got a real aggressive weakness problem, you know, in our society today. It really is. If you can make a good case for being the weakest, most victimized person, then you are the most powerful person out there. And it's kind of terrifying.
I mean, Julia Birchall calls it cry bullying as well in some areas. You know, that's how people think. Yeah. I'm about to be upset, you know, and so therefore you can't challenge me. And I'll just give you an example of how people learn this language. Somebody's telling me their students had gone for a tutorial. Nothing abnormal about that. But when they came out, listening to people in the corridor, they said, oh, that really damaged my mental health. So you learn to see even a difficult tutorial, right, as something that damages your mental health. And you really, you know, you have to battle against it. I mean, I've used that term snowflakes with some of my students almost as a joke. So even at PhD tutorials now, we get students who come and say, by their staff, most of my students, they say, can I have a snowflake moment? So you have a snowflake moment. They tell you that the cat's died or whatever, and then you get on with your with the intellectual part of life. But it's too often that obsession. People just want to talk about their feelings all the time, and I think it comes through in public debates. That often debate is a matter of expressing your feelings. You know, you just express what you feel or talk about your personal experience. And just in, you know, in preparation for this, I was thinking, can I just go on to why I think there's a male issue in this?
Yeah.
I mean, I was thinking about my own experiences of debating, and you have to be tough. And I was doing a discussion on free speech at I won't name the university, in the north of England, and we had 4 speakers. They were all men, but they weren't of one opinion. They had diverse opinions, and they're all experts. I was one of them. So the debate goes, and it's a largely left-wing audience who are saying there's no challenges to free speech. Anybody can speak. And then someone got up and said, look, why should we listen basically to all these men? Right? And then you listen to the responses from the men on the panel, and they all capitulated. They all started to say, oh yes, we've got to be more careful next year. And I said, don't be guilt tripped by this. You know, they were saying there's no challenges to anybody speaking, but there is a challenge. If you're white and you're male, we don't want to listen to you. That was a couple of years ago, but now it's increasingly the case that no one wants to listen to you if you're white or male. And I think, you know, there are other examples that you can list. And one, I was just thinking on my own experience and other people's experiences, I asked people about this, of just general informal debates, whether it's in a committee or whatever. And the one person that is never wanted to be heard is often the man. So that if you're a woman and you speak, right, then you get listened to with respect. And if you try to have a rigorous debate, then you're held to be too macho. But it's that, ironically, that saying you're being too macho and having a debate and allows just women to have the voice. So they're empowered by silencing you. And people soon learn not to do it, even if it's only body language. You know, and you can just see that you're not supposed to say this. I'm not saying people being rude, I just mean people trying to have a debate. And it's the same for students, because I had one student who wasn't at my university, another one came to me, and part of being involved in AFAF, we get students and staff from all over Britain and coming to us and talking about these issues that come up. And this student had been told off for putting forceful ideas. He'd learned a lot about the topic, and he's putting ideas forcefully in class. Been pulled aside by the tutor and told not to speak so much. And so the students learn not to speak. You know, and so you just get discussions in class or on panels that are just people listening to other people's experiences and feelings without any challenge. So I do think there is, you know, you can see it more blatantly now with the attack on white privilege. But it is the case that if you're male, and it may be obviously, and it's not just if you're male, but if you are male, particularly if you're white, you might not. And you know, I follow things on social media in the US where if you're Asian, the same thing happens to you. Male and Asian, there's a real attack against Asian males.
Yeah, they're becoming more white than the whites these days, aren't they?
And this sort of leads me into a question about where this is coming from, because on the one level you can think of it as coming from psychology, sociology, sort of coming up from the bottom up, if you like. But then, and I'm as resistant to conspiracy theories as anyone, but you have to ask yourself, is there an organizing principle here? Is there a controlling hand here? Because, I mean, that example of the Asians becoming more whiter than white, I mean, why would they? Well, because they're doing very well. And it's almost as if anyone that's doing very well has to be pulled down. So what do you think, Dennis? Is there, do you subscribe, not to a conspiracy theory, but is there something coming down from the top, whether it's, you know, government level or international level or what?
Well, let's go to the international level, because we did try to explain this, and obviously books criticising therapeutic education and therapy culture started in the late 90s and beyond, and we thought, well, we looked into it, and there's a clear thing that happens at the end of the Cold War from 1989, when everybody thought, you know, until that point, politics had been determined by whether you were pro Soviet Union, the alternative, the communist alternative, or you're defending capitalism. That disappeared completely. And there was a search for something to replace it. And people look for all sorts of different things. Remember, Francis Fukuyama wrote a book called The End of History, The Last Man, because that ideological had gone. And it really comes with the Democrats in the US and the whole shift to, it spontaneously filled the gap. The therapeutic turn just happened spontaneously. So I always remember Clinton's great phrase was, "I feel your pain." He was always saying that to me. I'm not going to do anything about it. I feel your pain. I empathize with you. And James Nolan reported on the Democratic Convention and said, like, it's a therapy group. So politicians started to relate to people as I called it, giving therapy to victims, T2V. Therapy to victims became the new way you related to people. And that was spontaneous. Nobody planned it. It's just, what else can you fill that gap with? You've got all these people, they have problems. You haven't got any policies or any vision to offer them. So you give them therapy. And the other incident I point to in the 80s, which I've always thought was the start of this, was the miners' strike in '84, because that depowered the entire working class male union-led movement, and to my mind, it created a position where the unions and the Labour Party had all the infrastructure of power, but their source of power and their source of moral legitimacy had been so emphatically crushed by Thatcher that they had to look around for something else. And so maybe that's part of it as well. I think that they did tap into it in the same way. If you, Thatcher was brought, the trade unions were brought back into discussions with Thatcher over education. And I think they soon saw that the way they now relate to their members is exactly the same. So you become, I've been an active trade unionist all my life, and first joint president of UCU, and you see that shift. So a membership of unions may be increasing, but it's a membership that consists of victims. And you can give lots and lots of examples. I give one in the book, I think, of when I was working at a previous university, we used to have, you got known as the union person. So the porters who do the security work came to see us one day, and they were saying that their shifts had been altered and that things were getting a bit difficult for them, and what could we do about it? I said, well, I knew their manager, and I said, well, let's go and see him, right, and sort it out, to just have a discussion. And they said, no, we don't want to talk to him. We just want to know why he doesn't like us. And you just realize that, you're just hopeless. And in those situations, it's all about what people feel about you rather than anything else. And it's easy. But the thing about victims, I always think Marx makes the point that the French peasantry were like a sack of potatoes. You couldn't really do anything with them. And that's what trade unions are like now. They're like a sack of victims. So, you can't do anything with victims except offer them therapeutic courses, which of course the trade unions do.
Well, this is where I think, is it a conspiracy tip? Because what this therapeutism is doing and wokeism is doing, turning us all into victims, is making us all weak. It's making us all intellectually feeble and emotionally feeble. And that's exactly what you want if you want to control the populace, isn't it? Do you subscribe to that?
It works. I think it's short term. It only works for a short time, because what it essentially does, people, when the book came out, people put headlines like, "We're creating can't cope kids," and all that. And can't cope adults are useless to politicians as well. You can keep them like that for a while, but it's not. And I was thinking of, I was really depressed. I know one of the questions you said you might ask me was, are universities finished? And
go on, answer that one.
Well, 2 years. Well, I write about the McDonaldization of universities, and I know some people call it neoliberalism in universities, but the bureaucratization of universities stifle them. There's no doubt about that. They stifle creative thinking, and then you have something, the therapeutic overlay, if you like. The therapeutic university doesn't contradict that bureaucratization. It actually is complementary to it. So how do you get people to work within a bureaucratic structure? You give them therapy. I mean, I once taught on a teacher training program, and I remember that it was all objectives. You know, you had to meet like 3,000 objectives and produce evidence for them. And what struck me as strange was when you went into classes, they were all doing Carl Rogers hugging the students. You know, it's all, everybody was being really nice to one another, and it's all small group work, and literally, thank you, it's wonderful being with you. And I kept thinking, this is like subjection to the yoke. You do that sort of therapeutic thing and you work them through. And I thought, if they're going to go from bad to worse, and I had George Ritzer, who wrote the McDonaldization of society, over to Britain, and he said British universities were much more McDonaldized than any American universities. It's actually worse here.
That's frightening.
But about 2 years ago, I went to Warwick University to debate free speech, as I always go all over debating it. And at the end of the meeting, some students came and said they'd like to start a free speech society. They didn't want to be involved with the Students' Union. And I thought, this is really, really good. And then over 2 years, more and more students are setting up free speech societies. We got a list of them on the AFAF website. So there was Liberate the Debate, which was several groups everywhere. And then there was the Exeter Free Speech Society, and then one girl in Oxford set up an Oxford Free Speech Society, and you know, people have contacted us about setting them up at their universities. Then there was Goldsmiths in Kent, coming from students, and that to me, I mean, the students have decided they've had enough of being told what to think. I think that's what's happening, and I think that, you know, gives me real hope. The downside, of course, it's the lecturers who are not defending the right to free speech. I mean, the recent elections for UCU, the University and College Union, I think over half the elected members signed a petition saying that free speech was a right-wing and neo-fascist agenda, and you weren't allowed to discuss things like trans rights or trans issues, not allowed to discuss them. So, you know, if you see, that's what's happened to the trade unions. You know, we're not having any discussion. And I think, to me, the telling moment was with the death this year of the slaughter of Samuel Patey. You know, do I have to say who he was?
No, yeah, remind us.
Yeah,
well, you know, on the 16th of October, he was beheaded by an Islamist in Paris. He was a teacher of geography, and he had on a session in his civics class on free speech, he'd shown the Charlie Hebdo cartoons to the class to show the France's belief in free expression. And he said to the Muslim students, you can leave or turn away, you don't have to see it. There was then a campaign to kill him, and he was slaughtered on streets. In France, and Macron, and people have criticised Macron because he isn't consistent on issues like free speech, but people made statements. Now, we checked, and not one British union, including UCU, or anybody from any of the education union, that is, or any union, or no university said anything about the murder. The exception was the National Education Union. On their international website, they mentioned that he'd been killed and said it's very sad, but they didn't mention he'd been killed for free speech. So there's total silence. I mean, the Charlie Hebdo murders and other ones are forgotten fairly quickly. This one has gone super speed. You know, the Je suis Samuel movement just disappeared, and Je ne suis Samuel. People have just ignored it. And to give students their due again, yesterday I discovered that a number of students at Oxford University have written to the Vice-Chancellor asking her, Louise Richardson, who's very good on free speech issues as it happens, to say something about the death of Samuel Patey and the need to defend free speech, coming from students. So if there is anything to be optimistic about, it's that students have had enough. You know, they're coming through educational systems where Ofsted say to them, Ofsted are obsessed by safeguarding. You know, you must never feel offended, you must never feel upset, you must never be challenged. You know, and they come to university, and of course they are challenged, intellectually challenged, and they don't like it. And there are all those absurd examples where, I don't know if you follow them, the recent, I don't want to listen to a lecture about the Industrial Revolution because my great-great-great-grandfather was a miner And, you know, and to think of his suffering is more than I can, and it goes on and on. And, you know, people just say you're making it up, but they're not making it up. Unfortunately, these things are everywhere. People find things to be offended about. But I do think they feel really offended sometimes because they're being taught that being offended is the worst thing. And that's why, you know, in 2006, where Roy Harris, who was the emeritus professor of linguistics at Oxford, and we were writing articles called, he wrote one called, it's a brilliant piece actually if you find it, Speaking Up for the Right to Speak Evil. And I'd done one, you can see where I was coming from. Here come the touchy-feely brigade. So there's all these things we could see that something was happening about free speech. And we had a long meal in Oxford, it was a great meal as it happened, but he was the founder of integrationist linguistics. And 2.5 hours with Roy really hurt your brain. You know, you have to, but we decided we'd write a statement of academic freedom and try and get people to sign up to it. But the key point about it was, we demanded a million view of free speech, and free speech, no ifs, no buts, whether or not it is deemed offensive was our clause. And, you know, that was really prescient because increasingly, you know, and you keep thinking that it would not seem new to people, but being offended is now the one reason going to get you in serious trouble. No, not be, sorry, being accused of being offensive is going to get you into trouble. And, you know, we do lots and lots of campaign work. And perhaps one of the most difficult things about it is trade unions don't take up free speech issues, but we do, and it takes up a lot of our time. But a lot of them, and this is our most worrying part, is you're in a catch-22 situation, because if you're going to be disciplined in a university for any speech issues, they have clauses that say you can't make it public, or it's another disciplinary issue.
Gagging clauses.
Yeah, it's a gagging clause. And even if you get a settlement, then, you know, if you break that settlement, you can be asked for the money back and costs, or you can have your career destroyed as well. So a lot of academics just want these things to go away. And they can be very trivial things that get you suspended for gross misconduct.
Yeah, well, of course, having gagging clauses or making things secret is the way you protect a system which would be unacceptable to most people did they know about it. And the family courts are a bloody good example of that, because you can't speak about what goes on in those either. Just coming back to the therapeutic education thing, well, before I forget this question. Boys famously, and coming back to the men and boys issue, boys famously are doing worse and worse in education. Is that a consequence of this approach? And is it because the therapeutic approach is more in tune with the feminine than the masculine?
I think it is. I mean, as I said before, that the emotions you're supposed to feel are those moments of empathy and concern and compassion. And I wouldn't say, I don't like the categorization. I think a lot of this, the categorization of people into groups, including white male, is always a bit dubious because they're different groups of people. And I do think it is, it's a general impact on the fact that if you stop teaching subjects, which you would see as hard subjects, you then create a climate where people don't feel they can do anything. So you wouldn't want to do masculine things. And I think in some senses where perhaps knowledge is masculine, you have to get away from your self-feelings. It's a masculinity that I'd be up for. People have said this, I used to like, powerful women who stood up. Elizabeth's here, she's a powerful woman. Or like Claire Fox, people who stand up and will take on everybody. But the condemnation of them is often that's too masculine. So I do think it's something we should encourage everybody to be. Yeah. I think it is. I don't think it. My take on this. I mean, I've been involved as a trustee at the East London Science School, and I think what has happened in some of those white working class areas, education has just disappeared. But thinking back on that, one of the examples we had in one part of the UK where they still have grammar schools, and I think it's in the book, is that the grammar schools were still teaching knowledge. They were teaching Latin, Greek, all the separate sciences, and yet the comprehensive schools are still called, but they're not comprehensive, or the community schools are focusing on emotional education. So you think, once you said the working class were thick, now you say, you know, they haven't got the right emotions. You know, that sort of, I think that is a real tendency. It's funny you mentioned the minors, because I gave a talk just before the book came out in Scotland, and I was going to do something about therapeutic education, and I thought, God, you know, I'm in Glasgow. I'm going to be talking at the home of the Glasgow Kiss, you know, Glasgow Kiss, headbutt, and I'm going to talk about therapeutic education. And then they talked about what they were offering in mining areas, and guess what? Yoga, craft classes. So what would you think?
Macrame for minors. Oh God,
yeah.
we're finished.
Well, mindfulness for minors is more. That's the sort of, you know, the obsession with mindfulness is. No, we couldn't predict it. I mean, we started thinking only about self-esteem, but every new fad and fashion that comes along, you know, is, you know, suddenly has a lot of take up. Mindfulness is absolutely everywhere in.
Is it perhaps just because it's easier? You know, it's easier to go down this route because, you know, physics and maths and Latin, it's hard stuff, isn't it?
Yeah.
Why bother?
Well, that's true. I mean, that is the case, you know. And the great power of therapeutic education is you're the one who knows more about your emotions than anybody else. So that, you know, that's true. But it's true if you've got a certain view of emotions. It's actually not true. I'm writing something about this now, actually, because the traditional view of emotions was that emotions are like something inside you in a black box that nobody else knows about. And I think therapeutic education has brought this back. The idea that you can look inside yourself and find your emotions, but often you can't do that. Because how you find your emotions traditionally, and you'll all know this, is by reading literature. You know, you don't know what you feel about love till you've read Shakespeare. You know, you read Shakespeare's sonnets, you know. I mean, I always quote the lovely line, my true love, I'm misquoting now, my love swears she is full of truth. I do believe her, though I know she lies. You know, the subtlety of emotions and things that you get in literature, that's how you learn your emotions. And you know, you can do it by you know, other people talking about you. I always give the example.
And typical masculine stoicism is now presented as a psychological pathology that has to be beaten out of men because you shouldn't be stoical. Well, stoical is just having emotions under proper control, and so you're in control of them and not the other way around, isn't it?
But one of the difficult things, and I face this, is you know, as a trade unionist as well. Often a lot of body organisations have women fronting them. There was a time where this was quite unique, but everywhere you go, you know, and I remember being in a situation where there was a senior university academic, a department meeting, and the trade union blokes would get up and start saying, "Oh, you're useless." And I could say to them afterwards, "No, just a second. Nobody, as soon as you do that, nobody listens to you anymore." So tactically, you say to them, speak calmly, you know, be polite, be tactful. So the danger is, and it's like my being bullied, just grow up, you know, it's a playground thing, you know, bust debates from the Beano. You have to find a new vocabulary, a new way around this, rather than just by reasserting it. I mean, I think one of the issues that, so we say you've got to counter therapeutic education by rebuilding a knowledge-based education. And one of the positive things we put in the introduction, there are now lots of knowledge schools springing up, and there are knowledge schools hubs, and people are networking.
Right.
And some are state schools, some are public schools, some are free schools. And there is a change. You know, in 2012, I had a meeting in London. Pimlico School sponsored it, and we tried to get everybody we could from all around the country who were in favour of knowledge-based education. We had 90. And I remember Manira Mercer, who was then Deputy Mayor of London, gave a speech, and she said a few years previously, you wouldn't have got 6 people and a dog in a room to discuss.
Oh, that's positive as well. Where do you stand on home education or homeschooling?
I have been involved in it, and in the past I was asked to be part of education otherwise. And if it's got a good basis to it, I think, you know, I can understand why people would do it now rather than send their children to some schools.
Yeah, I mean, if my 2 boys were now of school age, I wouldn't want to put them through the state education system. I just wouldn't see it as a positive thing to do at all.
Depends. You can select your schools, of course, with a bit of luck. You know, often you can't. And I think there's a real demand for knowledge-based schools. I mean, I think that is just interesting in itself. Schools where you go through the door and you've got quotes from Matthew Arnold, you know, to learn and propagate the best that has been known and thought. But it's a real battle, and it's partly a trade union issue, because we've tried to have debates. You know, when Michael Gove was hated, they did this thing about, he talked about the blob of Toby Young. So it was, and they called him Pob. So it's Pob versus the blob. But trying to get teachers to debate education, they just see it as an attack on them. You know, you're insulting it. So, you know, so I think working your way through all these issues without coming out, getting people coming over as really crass is difficult. The hostility to debate is something that, you know, has led to lots of formal debates. So, you know, just in my own university, the Vice Chancellor is quite keen on debates. We've decided that we're going to, well, we decided before the pandemic hit us, and we're still doing face-to-face teaching, by the way. We decided to sort of refocus and relaunch debate in every class. So the first thing we're going to do is have a major debate for all staff, academics and non-academics, on what is a university for, and start having a discussion. You know, and it's always a bit artificial. And Elizabeth will know, because setting up salons, you know, in the image of the 18th century seems a bit odd, but you can only do it now. You have to do it slightly artificially to get people to come and debate. And perhaps one of the examples of it is book clubs, which strike me as very strange things. People used to just read and discuss books, but now you have book clubs where people come together and read and discuss books. So I think you have to find ways in which you can have open debate and discussion. The real danger that I think that has arose over the last year, I think, in relation to Black Lives Matter as well, is that anybody who dares say anything critical is likely to be cancelled. You know, the idea of whether cancel culture exists, you know, I know from our experience, it's not just the banned list where we have, you know, lots and lots of, Elizabeth has appeared on the banned list at least once, she'll run it again, I'm sure. But, you know, you can just see that, you know, it's hard to find out about a lot of the cases, and a lot of the cases we can't put up, but you know, there is an increasing tendency to, if you say something people disagree with, for them to contact your employer through Twitter and 1,000 other ways and say you should be sacked. And all right, that doesn't happen often, but everybody else learns the lesson. You know,
that's
symbolic for everyone. You know, just keep quiet.
In talking about teaching and men and boys, one question I haven't asked, but it would be remiss not to ask it, is to raise the issue of male teachers, because whilst male teachers has always been a small minority in primary schools, they used to be the majority in secondary schools, and every year there's fewer and fewer secondary school male teachers. I think they're only about 1 in 3 now, even in secondary schools. So what do you think's driving that? Is that related to the therapeutic thing, or what?
I think it's more related probably to safeguarding and the whole paedophile scares. The fact that, you know, I'm not saying it's conscious, but it's just that, why would you go into schools? I mean, it's actually quite, it may change, of course, with a recession as people naturally go back to schools, but, and it isn't true in all schools, of course. I think in some of the free schools and in some public schools, that's still the case that you get a lot of male teachers. But who would be a teacher? I mean, the difficulty is, you know, we have, you know, this is where you start to think, be careful what you say, you know, because you know, often people who've come out of teacher training, the first thing that has to happen before they go into a school and do anything useful, if you're in a knowledge-based school, is they knock teacher training out of them, because they're told, you know, mostly it's therapeutic stuff. It's woke, both woke and therapeutic. You know, you've got to be inclusive. You've got to, you know, teach a lot of snake oil like learning styles and co-construction of learning, all the stuff they get in teacher education, nothing to do with knowledge. I mean, teacher education 20 years ago was philosophy, psychology, history of education, and it was all based on the subjects. And, you know, now there's none of that.
I mean, I couldn't possibly be a teacher, despite being pedagogic by nature and having done A-level tuition, you know, in my own house. I couldn't possibly ever be a teacher. No way. I couldn't face all that. It'd be impossible. One thing we haven't addressed, and we've been going, I think, for nearly 45 minutes, so we'll probably have to accelerate this now, but we haven't really talked about academics for academic freedom. We've skirted around free speech, but society or organisation is all about, what it stands for, what its membership is, and so
on. I mentioned that we set it up originally as a statement with Roy Harris in 2006. We wrote the statement and it really hit the headlines. Hundreds of people joined it and signed up to the statement. We had, I remember the Times Higher had, academics demand the right to offend. Because we never demanded the right to offend, just the right to say what we wanted to say, whether or not it offended you. But yeah, that's the way it was. Look, it wasn't a demand for a legal right. It was just to bring us back to that state of John Stuart Mill, you know, free speech. But you know, we've changed. I mean, we're a very small organisation, we're growing, but I have to mention this. I'm going to put it on the website because people keep asking. We've got a core team, which is me as director, and we have 2 lawyers working pro bono and a barrister working pro bono, some of them brilliant ones, by the way. Then we have an events manager who's going to organise our conference, and then 4 academics to do various things. So Mark runs the band list and so on, but that's the core team. We've toyed with membership, but what we've set up is a network of what we call correspondents. So it's people who are at different universities around the world. In fact, we've got them in Mexico and Australia, who will just keep us informed about what's going on. And that's basically the core. And eventually we'll put all their names up so they can be contacted. And the issue there is a legal one, of course, which comes in every issue. If they speak, it's on their own right and not as ours if we don't approve it, because you don't know what people are going to say. And we live in a litigious environment. But most of our time is now taken up with people who contact us regularly about issues in their workplace. And often they'll be because some student has seen something they've seen on social media, and then they put in a complaint. Or you get complaints from various bodies. So you write something about any public organisation, and somebody from there is likely to write and say, you shouldn't be allowed to say this to your university.
So do you keep an inventory of all these instances?
We keep one of the things that we'd like to do, and one of the issues we had is with the gagging clauses. So there's one person, I can mention his name, Chris Hill, who was at the University of Central Lancashire, who we helped in a case. And he had a settlement and moved on to university and then retired, but he made his case public. Okay. So we have that case. And that was a very small issue where he had said, I'd rather have a centre for mathematics than a centre for multi-faith education. Gross misconduct. Yeah.
So do you advocate on behalf of people that are accused in this way? Is that part of what?
Right. Yeah, we give them advice and we take up the issues, and it does take a lot of time, not just for the lawyers, but for our members as well. But what we did try to do, and we worked on this, I'm still working on it with journalists, was to get some of the people who are subject to gagging clauses to bring their cases into the public realm. And we did work for a long time with one newspaper, I won't mention which one, who and we got them interviews with lots and lots of people in different universities, different issues. Often the trivialist things can be classified as gross misconduct. And they wouldn't publish it because they didn't want to be named. That's the issue. Yeah. So,
is there any relationship between your organisation and what I think it's Jonathan Haidt in the States has going? I think he calls it the Unorthodox Academy.
The Heterodox Academy.
Heterodox Academy. That's right. Yeah. Heterodox.
Well, we've got our friends that we set up. I mean, I'm on the advisory board of Toby Young's Free Speech Union because he's got a good base of people there. And And we've got links with the National Association of Scholars and other organisations in Canada. But the Heterodox Academy was an experiment, really. It's not so much a campaigning group. Its idea was it was quite difficult to join. You had to present your CV and get approved. But that was the idea, to set up an organisation of people with different views. So you know, it's sort of it'd be interesting to see how it goes. But it's sort of developed a few thousand members. But then if you're just there to be heterodox, where do you go from there? That's the issue, because they have got organisations like FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, which Jonathan and others are also involved with. That and in they do the campaign. Interestingly, FIRE started when one of its founding members was involved in what they call the shadow university, and exactly one of our cases where a student was accused of racism, and it was all within the structures of the university, and he just went public on it. Something you can do much easier in America because of the First Amendment to the Constitution. Yeah. And that made it a big public issue. It's the famous water buffalo case, where the student had some Afro-Caribbean black students were making a lot of noise, and he said, "Stop making noise, you water buffaloes." And it went through, and he was Jewish, and it was a Jewish expression. All this. It went on, but it would have. They make the point. The founding members of FIRE made the point that in many cases that would never have become public. He would have been disciplined and perhaps thrown out of university. No one would know. And the difficulty with all these things is, you know, when you talk to people, they'll say to you, "I don't want my case," because their futures depend on this. You can have your 15 minutes of fame, and that's it. It's different. I mean, it's different for you and for journalists, I think. I mean, they can be cancelled, but they've still got their jobs. If you're cancelled in a university, it's not always the case. I mean, people get defended. You know, Selena Todd was cancelled.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, many people have said to me, men in particular, that, you know, if I might have spoken out about domestic violence against men in my workplace when I was still employed, but people would say to me, "It's all right for you, Rick, you're going to retire in a couple of years anyway." Whereas for younger people, they have to be more protective, otherwise, you know, they can't pay the mortgage. So that's what that is, I think, why in the men's movement you get a lot of retired men who've been fuming for years, and when they're retired, they can finally speak out.
I don't accept that, really. I mean, I get that as well. You know, people have said to me, and say for years, "It's all right if you're a professor, right? You can say these things." Well, that's not true for a start, but also I always said them. The thing is, I think you just have to say to people, I mean, I was thinking the one message you need to get in other things is just speak up. You know, the more people who speak up, the less, it's not difficult. Just say what you think, you know, no ifs, no buts. Say what you think. And then if more people did that, there wouldn't be an issue. Yeah. But, you know, it's no good, you know, if you're just quiet, you know, you're going to make that situation worse.
Yeah, I do think that the whole cancel culture woke brigade thing is a paper tiger, and, you know, everybody's terrified of it. But I think that most people are actually pretty reasonable. And if we did all stand up and just say, "No, we're not accepting this," the paper tiger would blow away.
Yeah, that's right. But it's hard to know. If you take, I've been battling on unconscious bias training at the university. And we got an agreement that trying to get an agreement that all controversial issues will be resolved through debate and discussion, or just because if you have to do the training, you have to do it, but you don't have to do it in the way you must. This is what you must think. You know, you can do it through debating the issues and what's behind it. And I think I just don't understand why people don't just defend their right to speak up more. I mean, if people just defended their right to free speech, then that would be a lot better than worrying about if I say something, you know, something may happen to me. I mean, but the irony of all this, I used to think that I was quite safe just arguing about free speech. You know, I don't actually say anything controversial like you. You know, I just say, "Oh, defend the right. I defend your right to justice for men and boys. Yes, free speech." But now, of course, you can't do that because free speech itself is something that should be stopped. There is that cancel culture about free speech. You know, things are not to be discussed anymore. So it's moving on to a new level. But it is true. I think if you're not on Twitter and you're in the wider world, it is easier to win the arguments. And I had a discussion a couple of years ago, there was some members of HR and about TERFs. And they said, what are you talking about? And I had to try and explain what people called a TERF. And so people just don't know, in the real world, all this stuff doesn't have any resonance with people. So I think, you couldn't build a campaign. So that's a part of the issue. All these comedians like Andrew Doyle and everybody who used to be really funny are now just campaigning against wokeness. Sometimes they're still funny, but they stop being comedians. They're sort of just being anti-woke. And I think it's a dead end, I think, because you need to get people engaged in debates. And I think that's the way. It's always debate is the way forward. And people will often say to me, well, what happens after debate? Because it's not what happens after debate. Debate to me is politics of the moment now. Because we live in the climate where debate is not only unfashionable, it's suppressed. And you can't get anywhere unless you have debate. So I think the more we engage in debate, the more chance we have of changing things. So that's would be my message to everybody, rather than just campaigning. You get it a lot in America where people sort of almost reify issues. I just read Gad Said's book on what is
the parasitic mind.
The parasitic mind. And I think he's overdoing it. It isn't that we're like there's an infectious disease that's going to conquer us. It can be challenged through debate. I think seeing it infectious makes people feel fatalistic about it. I know he does say you've got to speak up, but there's this. You always feel doing it. It's the same in the McDonaldization literature as well. It's almost an inevitable thing. It's an unstoppable machine that's going to kill critical thinking. And I think that idea that we don't have agency and we can't actually deal with things can only come out through debate. And I do think that's when it really arises. And I think I'll just give you one example where I think having a debate really illuminates issues. Some students at the university at Derby set up a thing called Get Off the Fence, nothing to do with me, they just set it up. And they had debates. And one of the debates was, does dyslexia exist? And they had a research student who'd been researching dyslexia, and a panel of people, mostly who'd had dyslexia or experience of it. And the debate went, well, I had dyslexia and this happened and this happened. And then the researcher says, yes, but none of that works. The research shows that, templates over your letters don't work. And then the response is, oh, yes, but they seem to work for me. So the debate was knowledge versus personal experience. And personal experience sort of triumphs over debate. But having that debate clarified for me what's going on. It's now the emphasis on your personal experience and your feelings, of course, over facts. But having the debates brings that to the fore. So people raised it in the discussion. And I think, the more we have those sorts of debates, the more, debating dyslexia, of course, is a major issue in society because almost everybody's got it. If you get tested, you will have it. That's just the way it goes. I think, that's the message we should put forward in all our platforms. Make sure there's lots of time for debate. So even now, you think the battle of ideas model, and Elizabeth experienced it, and I think as well, is that you have short speeches and then lots of time for debate and discussion, and that does two things in the traditional Millian liberal sense. You allow you to express your ideas, but also have them challenged, and other people to express theirs. But it's only by having your ideas challenged that you even understand what you actually believe. Because if you just repeat the mantras all the time, you might be wrong. But being challenged really helps. So that's why you give more time to the people who are engaging in debate as you do to the speakers. I think
you mentioned J.S. Mill earlier, and there's a great quote from J.S. Mill on just about everything, isn't there? But there is a good one on that. It's something like, who knows his own views, who doesn't understand the views of others, and it's in better language.
But if you think about it, it's often, if you just repeat what you think is true, you can just a parrot, really. You may not even understand what you believe unless you put it into the public realm and have a debate about it.
Yeah, that's another aspect of the cruelty of what's going on with the denial of knowledge-based education. Students go in believing, if they go in believing radical left-wing things, they are taught a load more radical left-wing things and never taught any opposing ideas, and it's not fair to them. It doesn't give them, you know, a chance to formulate their responses when they go out into the outside world and find out that everyone isn't a radical leftist. And it's really no wonder, especially with all the therapeutic stuff that's going on, that they just can't cope when they are exposed to these other ideas. And then you get the cancel culture.
Yeah, I think, yeah, it is true that the therapy culture is often used to impose a lot of social justice ideas, the idea that, you know, works. But students are aware of it. I think, you know, during Brexit was the key thing for me, because a lot of our students come from Brexit families. I mean, the Brexit vote up here, it's 70%. But once they get into university, they learn very quickly that all the lecturers are Remainers. Not all. You know that when you suddenly they find out that you're not, they see the response. So they learn very quickly that they get all these ideas imposed upon them from their lecturers, uncritically often, but they don't agree with them. So that's the idea, is to sort of challenge that. And I think that's why I go back to those free speech societies. The more students themselves get involved in debates, the more they can free themselves and at least have time to challenge those ideas. Because
it is the job of the youth to be rebellious, after all.
It is indeed.
Well, traditionally it was. I mean,
well, it's that, from what you've been saying about, you know, the younger generation now, maybe they are still our ray of hope, because it seems to be the students versus the lecturers. So I know what side I'm on.
I'd like to, well, I'd be happy with that. I mean, the issue is, you know, the students are happy to challenge. I mean, sometimes they will say, you know, am I allowed to criticize? You'll soon know from the lectures, from the body language and everything, whether you're not allowed. You know, these are the truths we're going to tell you. But, you know, that's not education in my view. But I think, you know, the more these groups continue, and they are expanding, and I do think it's interesting and brave of a lot of those students to set up these organisations, and there are more individuals as well. But I think that, of course, they have to deal with the Students' Union, but sometimes by setting up those organisations, the Students' Union have to respond. So I do think, you know, it would be a really important thing to encourage it. Well, it's not for us to encourage it, because students will do it themselves. But if academics were at least involved in the debate.
Talking about student unions, though, I mean, what I constantly hear is most students at universities don't really support what the NUS is doing, either locally or nationally. So why don't they set up their own alternative unions then in universities?
Well, why would you set up a union? I mean, they wouldn't set up a union, they wouldn't even have anything to do with the unions. I mean, there was a time when the University of Derby was quite famous for banning things. If you go down the ban list, and they banned Blurred Lives, they banned, I think they, who did they ban? I can't remember. I think they even banned the Farage, somebody, or Christian groups. They were banning all sorts of things. And I used to get outraged and go into the atrium and talk to the students and say, you know, they've just banned blurred lines. And they'd say, well, I don't know about that. Well, they've just banned this. And then you know, nobody knows. Nobody's interested in what they're doing in their little world. It's all political ploys for them. But I think actually we got around that by having a discussion with the Students' Union about not patronising their own members and seeing them as victims and things that people must be protected. And so they removed a lot of their no platforming issues. But I think it just takes time to challenge them. But people aren't aware. So I don't think students unions are partly part of management now. So they're all not every committee because of the Office for Students. They've got to be involved in everything. So most students just take no notice of them whatsoever. And I think that's the but why do you need a student union? I mean, like me, old-fashioned, I tend to think about these things, you know, let's have a sit-in. What's a sit-in? You know, it's not going to happen. I remember a couple of years ago having a discussion with another group of students, not at Derby, and there was a strike, and they were saying, what do you do in a strike?
Oh my goodness.
We said to them, well, when you go and lie down in the road, that's what you do, and block the cars coming in. And they just, no, it's like, I'm old-fashioned and just think, let's have a student rebellion. I just think, I mean, the best way for them to rebel is through debate. Let's have a look. You know, if they can get debates going, then that's fairly, it seems safe, and it's actually the most challenging thing you can do, because you can have, you know, debates about lots of issues. I mean, feminism being one debate. Higher education and schools are full of people who declare themselves to be feminists. Is feminism good or bad? Those sort of debates really need to have. And then we get more time. There's a whole range of issues that you.
Well, I think Elizabeth took part in such a debate at Bath a couple of years ago.
Oh yeah.
My first. Sorry. Oh dear.
I think that's probably the time to wind it up anyway, isn't it? Because we've been going well over an hour.
Oh no.
Oh, so.
Yeah.
Okay.
So poor old Tom will have to edit it down a bit, because this will have to go live about this time tomorrow, I think. So you'll have to get your skates on.
Good luck with the editing.
Well, thank you so much for talking to us, and I hope we can have another conversation in the not too distant future, us three. Gender matters.
Absolutely, because we didn't exhaust all the questions.
No.
Let's have a debate.
Let's have a debate.
Okay.
Yeah. Great call.
Yeah, that was excellent.
Okay, thanks everybody.
Very
Bye.
good, Dennis. Thanks very much.
Bye.
Thanks for the time. Bye.
Yeah, I'll wait for my P45.